Hello, welcome to the second episode of Research MD. Disclaimer, I'm not a doctor, I'm a medical student. And why I made this channel, in a nutshell, I want to empower people to understand scientific articles. And more explanation is on my first video. But if you're just tuning in for the first time, welcome. And let's go for a ride. So this article is from the Journal of Pediatrics. It's the official journal of the American Academy of Pediatrics. We're going to talk about a meta-analysis regarding, does breastfeeding, could that reduce the incidence of SIDS? If I have a baby and I'm breastfeeding my baby, does it mean that it'll be less likely that the baby will die from SIDS? In terms of like hierarchy of study designs, I just want to point out the meta-analyses, which you study a compilation of different studies on that same topic, in this case, breastfeeding and SIDS, and then you come up to a conclusion from several studies. What the researchers did here are they found 288 studies from Medline, which is like a database of scholarly articles, and they found 24 original case control studies. And I'll talk about what that means in a second. But then they had like an inclusion criteria, like does this paper meet our, what we think SIDS and breastfeeding is? Is this study done in a acceptable manner? And then they use odds ratios for each to evaluate, that overall question. Does breastfeeding reduce the incidence of SIDS? Now going back to what case control studies are, you have cases. In this case, cases are those unfortunate mothers and fathers whose child died of SIDS, and you get those mothers, and then you see how many of them breastfed and how many did not. And then for the controls, you look for mothers whose child did not die of SIDS, but who are the same. Everything else are very similar to the mother whose child died of SIDS. So for instance, let's call mother A Susan and mother B Joanna. So Susan's child died of SIDS and Joanna's child did not. But Susan and Joanna are both the same age. They're both the same race, white. They're 27. They're both in the lower income bracket, and it's both their first child. And so that's a case control. And within, Joanna, the control, and other controls as well, you also see, how many of them breastfed and how many did not. And then you do some analysis. And some of the analysis that these studies and this study did are odds ratios. So odds ratios are, what are my odds of a baby developing SIDS if I breastfed? And compared to a mom whose baby died of SIDS who did not breastfeed. So an odds ratio greater than 1, so let's say 3, means if I breastfed my baby, I'm more likely to have a baby die of SIDS than a mother who did not breastfeed their baby. An odds ratio of 1 is basically, it didn't matter if I breastfed my baby. There's no association with that and SIDS. And an odds ratio less than 1 but greater than 0, so basically like a decimal or a fraction. Let's say 0.1, which is what we want. Is basically, if I breastfeed my baby, it's less likely that my baby will die of SIDS compared to a mother who did not breastfeed their baby. So that's what the researchers are looking for. They're looking at all these studies, and these studies have odds ratios, and they try to compile all the odds ratio to make their own summarized odds ratio, which in this study they called SOR right here, summary odds ratio. And let's just step back and see how they collected these articles from Medline database. So you want studies to be reproducible, and they're trying to be as transparent as possible. So they told us what they searched for: a sudden infant death, breastfeeding, SIDS, cot death, breastfeeding. And then you had reviewers independently evaluate the studies. And this is important because you might be biased. You might want to get published, and you might say, hey, this study is favorable, so I'm going to include this one, but not that one, which doesn't have the result I want. So by having two groups do it independently, it makes readers more reassured that this is less biased. And basically, they had inclusion criteria, which means like what do we define as SIDS? What do we define as breastfeeding? And we want to make sure the studies we collect also have the same idea as to what breastfeeding and SIDS is. So in terms of SIDS, they defined it as the 6 criteria developed by the American Academy of Pediatrics Task Force on Positioning in SIDS. Pretty reliable. And then for breastfeeding, they had like 3 different terms: breastfeeding of any amount or duration, breastfeeding of any amount at the age of 2 months or older, and exclusive breastfeeding, meaning like no formula at all. And then those studies that they picked, which were promising and they looked thoroughly over, but they rejected, they actually, they put it out on a table to be transparent so that we can see and and agree with them. So this is the flow chart and in terms of the distillation that was done from 200 plus articles to 18. And this is the table that includes all the studies, even including the failed study. And so for results, let's talk about the exciting finding. Like what did they find? This is like really fascinating. So for infants who received any amount of breast milk for any duration, the univariable summary odds ratio was 0.4. Now we're going to get back to what that meant. And 95% confidence interval 0.35, 0.44. So what that means is we're 95% sure that this summary odds ratio is in between 0.35 and 0.44. And then the 5% might be outside due to chance. And then they talk about the multivariable summary odds ratio was 0.55. So remember, lower than 1 and closer to 0 is better. It means that there's, if a mother breastfeeds their baby, they're less likely to get SIDS. So what is univariable summary odds ratio, multivariable summary odds ratio? Remember, meta-analysis is a compilation of different studies, right? Now, univariable summary odds ratio is you get these odds ratio and then you have a summary odds ratio. And you're not controlling for anything. Like for instance, maybe those mothers who didn't breastfeed were poorer. Maybe they were older or younger. And so that's where a multivariable summary odds ratio is. You have those odds ratio, you summarize it into one odds ratio that compiles all these other odds ratios. And then you control for different factors like race, socioeconomic status, if the baby was sleeping on its back. They talk about fixed effect and random effect inverse variance methods of meta-analysis. So if you want to, I'm just going to go over this briefly, just the general idea. But if you want to read more, this is a great paper about fixed effects versus random effects. Basically, and what they're trying to talk about is, if you have one study that has like 100 people, say another study that has 5 people, you're going to you want a weighted average when you do a meta-analysis, right? So basically, the fixed effect and random effect are just ways about how do you assign the weights to that study that had 100 people versus the study that had 5 people. So here is the result here. This is for univariable analysis of any breastfeeding versus non-breastfeeding. So you can see here, there are a couple of studies that passed 1. And remember, 1 means, or their confidence interval passed 1. Basically, this is their finding. And then we're 95% sure that the actual odds ratio is somewhere between this and this. And this hand actually crosses 1. Basically, remember, odds ratio of 1 is if I breastfeed my child, there's no association with that and a baby dying of SIDS. Even though you had those studies that crossed over 1, you take the whole average, you take the weighted averages of these odds ratio and you come out with the summary odds ratio, and you can see here it's less than 1, meaning that if I any type of breastfeeding I do with my child is less likely for my child to die of SIDS than a mother who did not do any breastfeeding. Now let's see what this table shows. This is a univariable analysis of exclusive breastfeeding of any duration. This is babies who did not take any formula, just only mom's breast milk. And you can see here the odds ratio is 0.27, right? The summary odds ratio is 0.27 compared to 0.4. Because 0.27 is closer to 0 than 0.4, you have an even greater association of, if I breastfeed my child and just breastfeed my child, I'm even less likely to get SIDS compared to a mother who did not breastfeed their child. Now, let's talk about the multivariable analysis of any breastfeeding versus no breastfeeding. So the summary odds ratio is 0.55, and the confidence interval doesn't cross 1. So what does this mean? So the multivariable summary odds ratio took into account they controlled for other factors. For instance, the mother whose baby died of SIDS who didn't breastfeed, maybe their baby slept on their stomach, or maybe they were just very young, or maybe they came from a lower socioeconomic status. And so these are the factors that they controlled for. Birth weight, if the infant's exposed to tobacco smoke before or after delivery, socioeconomic status, infant sleep position, and all these factors right here. And even controlling for that, the odds ratio was significant at 0.55, did not cross 1. Because that summary multivariable odds ratio was less than 1, it basically meant that, if I breastfeed my child, regardless of my race, my age, my social economic status, my baby's less likely to die of SIDS compared to a mother who didn't breastfeed. And it seems like breastfeeding itself is a protective factor. And in terms of causation, let's talk. We can't say that not breastfeeding causes SIDS. We would have to do a randomized trial, and that would be unethical because we can't assign mothers to say, hey, don't breastfeed your child. That would not be right. So they're basically saying we can't prove it in case control studies, but they're saying it's probably likely that there's a causation kind of with protective factor with breastfeeding and decreased SIDS because a lot of the studies had consistent findings. There was a strong association and there was a dose response effect, meaning remember the studies that just exclusively did breastfeeding greater than 2 months, those had a low odds ratio that was closer to 0 than was 1. And then causal factor preceding the outcome, for instance, you breastfeed first and then you see whether the baby passed away from SIDS or not. And then lastly, they even explain like a biological factor. Breast milk has the antibodies that mom had against various diseases. So it protects them from an immune perspective, and also breastfed infants are more easily aroused from active sleep, so at 2 to 3 months of age. So maybe when you're having difficulty, the infant's having difficulty catching their breath for some reason or another, breastfed babies are more likely to awake from that compared to a formula-fed baby. And then I really like this paper because it goes into its limitation and it's very transparent about it. And in a way, by showing your weaknesses, you're making your paper even stronger. They say their limitation was maybe all the studies they collected were just preferentially published, meaning only those studies that found a decreased incidence of SIDS among mothers who breastfed were the ones that were published. And those studies that the publishers didn't want that. And so maybe that could contribute to their findings. And then remember those 5 studies that failed to meet the criteria? Now this is pretty impressive because they say, let's say we included those 5 studies. How would our summary odds ratio change? Would it, it was a decimal, a fraction, would it jump to 1? And here it says, it goes higher to 0.49 and 0.68, the univariable and the multivariable summary odds ratio, but it still doesn't cross 1. So, conclusion, breastfeeding is protective against SIDS. It seems like in and of itself it is, because you had control and you looked at a lot of different studies. So the recommendation, and it's stronger, this decrease in SIDS, if you just exclusively breastfeed. And so there's the recommendation to breastfeed infants should be included with other SIDS risk reduction messages, such as making sure the baby sleeps on his or her back.